Welcome. I'm thrilled to begin the second lecture of this series. In our first lecture, we focused on the field of scholarship in Judeo-Arabic. We met Saadia as the revolutionary who brought this about, but also the one who anchored Jewish tradition in Judeo-Arabic. Almost everything that we saw in the last lecture was in Judeo-Arabic. You may remember we saw a preface in Saadia's biblical Hebrew towards the end, but everything that we looked at, monographs, Saadia's tafsir, work on legal topics in Judeo-Arabic, everything was in Judeo-Arabic. Today, we're going to look at daily life in Judeo-Arabic. I said to you last week when we looked at the maps that 90% of the world's Jewish community became Arabic speaking during this period. We're talking about from the early 800s till the 12th or 13th century. We can say that the majority of the Jews of the world are native Arabic speakers. So we need to look at daily life in Judeo-Arabic. Judeo-Arabic was not only a field of scholarship, of preserving tradition, it was also the way in which Jews went about their daily life. So we're going to look today at family life on the basis of documents from the Cairo Genizah. We're going to look at topics of books and readers and how Jews in this Arabic-speaking sphere talked about books and their reading habits. We're going to talk about Judeo-Arabic, finally, a closer look at the language of these documents. And finally, we're going to look at the question of how these documents survived. How do we have this unparalleled view of daily life in the Arabic-speaking Middle East 1,000, 1,100 years ago? So we start with a manuscript fragment from the Cairo Genizah, preserved in the collections of the Jewish Theological Society of America Library, and I thank them for the rights to show their manuscript fragments here. I shall not stay with this man a single hour. So what this document is a young woman's request to divorce. And what I want to do first is to talk about the language of this document. You see this is a ripped document. When I show the translation, you will see that sections are missing. And so what's in parentheses is going to be places missing. There are certain important points missing here, which I'm going to point out. Because this is a ripped fragment, oftentimes the fragments preserved in Judeo-Arabic from the Cairo Genizah are ripped, so I will fill them in. So the purpose of today is to show you that not only was Arabic the language of daily life and the default language for writing literature, but it was everything in between. So to look at this document in depth, I'm going to bring you this initial line, and we're going to look at it carefully. So I'm going to read it to you. الذي نسأل حضرة ربينو هراv hamuvhak أدام الله عزها. Okay, so this is a mix, you may have realized, of Arabic and Hebrew. It is the opening to a letter. It is a formal opening. If I were to translate it literally, it is the following. What we request of our honor, our Rav, the prominent rabbi, may God make his honor last forever, eternal. So this is in Hebrew letters, as you see. It's in a mix of Arabic and Hebrew. And this is very common in the beginnings of letters from the period. When you write a letter, you want to honor the recipient of the letter, and you do so by using an elevated Hebrew to show him respect, embedding this within an Arabic framework. So when we talk about Judeo-Arabic, we're talking about the Arabic language, often in Hebrew script. And by the time we get to the 10th century, which was the century we focused on in the previous lecture, the 11th century and the 12th century, which are the centuries we'll look at today, Judeo-Arabic is normally written in Hebrew script. This is not to say that Jews never wrote Arabic in Arabic script. We do find, especially in earlier periods, Jews writing Arabic in Arabic script. Also sometimes in later periods. It depended on the writer, how cosmopolitan he was, how comfortable he felt writing in Hebrew. Suffice it to say that from about 1000 on, we are most likely to find Judeo-Arabic as the Arabic language but written in Hebrew script. As you can see, Judeo-Arabic includes Hebrew and Arabic words. Here we had Harav Hamuvhak, okay, the prominent rabbi. Framing this Hebrew usage, Harav Hamuvhak, you have Arabic, and you have the typical Arabic words used in letters. So for example, the use of the word hadra. Hadra means your honor. It is typically used in Arabic letters written by all, whether you were Jewish, Muslim, Christian. If you were writing a letter, you would refer to your recipient in the third person. Also the honorarial epithet at the end, Adamallahu izzaha, may God make his strength eternal. This also is a very, very common formulaic way to begin a letter. So it's in the Hebrew script, however, it really reflects typical modes of writing a letter in Arabic during this period. It does, this kind of language does use Hebrew and Aramaic, but if you were to read it aloud to an audience on a street in Egypt in the 10th or 11th centuries, that is, getting beyond the question of script, they would say that sounds like literary Arabic. So if many of you are familiar with a sort of continuum of the Arabic language, from spoken Arabic to literary Arabic, with many different types in between, the language of written Judeo-Arabic during the period we're discussing is quite close to literary Arabic, meaning the Jews who wrote these documents would have spoken a dialectal Arabic. They would not have spoken the type of Arabic they're writing down, because they are denizens of the Arabic-speaking sphere, which differentiates between the way you write and the way you speak. They strove to write a very literary form of Arabic. So that's a word on Judeo-Arabic. Now, to go back to this letter. So I'm bringing a translation of this request, as we said, the request of a young girl to divorce. It's a document that was published originally by Shlomo Dov Goldstein, who is one of the important researchers of the Cairo Genizah, and who I will discuss more a bit later. And it was republished recently with a modified translation, which is the one I use, by my colleague, Dr. Oded Zinger of the Hebrew University, in his wonderful book, Living with the Law, Gender and Community Among the Jews of Medieval Egypt, which I think is a must read. So I'm going to read to you this document in the translation, which is mainly Goldstein's translation. In God's name, and you may have noticed, by the way, I'll just note, in the beginning of this document, you see the bet shin at the top right. So that's this in God's name that Goldstein is translating, typical way to open a letter. This is what we ask Your Excellency, our Master, the distinguished Rabbi. May God make your exalted position permanent and your leadership solid. Please let us have your legal opinion about what has to be done in the following matter. So what was preserved in this case, in this fragment, is a question to the rabbi. Okay? We don't yet know what the question was, even though I already revealed it, and now we're going to see. A long time ago, female captives, among them little girls, arrived here. Here is in Egypt. A woman took a little girl into her house in order to bring her up, doing this as a pious work. That woman had 3 virgin girls and 2 boys, grown-up bachelors. She brought the girl up, who stayed with her 5 or 4 years until she came of age. And the idea of the redeeming of captives, the ransoming of captives, taking captives into your home was a feature of the period. One of the 2 boys of that woman asked for her hand, of the girl who had been adopted. They consulted the local judge, may God keep him, whether this marriage was permissible. He said, it is. They arranged the marriage and gave her whatever God had blessed them with. However, after the marriage, she did not stay with her husband longer than 4 months. And the reason there's a question mark there is because the manuscript is ripped at that point. So it's for something. And what Goldstein and also Oded Zinger assume is that what's written there is the word months, ashur in Arabic, and returned to the house of the woman in which she had been brought up, and said, I shall not stay with this man a single hour. Se'atan. The elders and the judge, may God keep him, urged her all the time to reconsider the matter. But she said, and we don't know what she said, they exercised on her all kinds of pressure and talked to her in different ways. But she said, I shall not stay with this man, even if he pours gold over my head. Then the woman's children drove her out of the house. She did not agree, and this is where the text is cut off. So we, by the way, the phrase, even if he pours gold over my head, all of these are very decoratively written in Arabic. We don't have the end of this story. What it reflects, and this is a historian's dream, this kind of document reflecting daily life from the period, it reflects the idea that pressure was exerted on women to try to make them stay within marriage frameworks. You see, for example, in this quote, they urged her all the time to reconsider the matter. And Oded Zinger, my colleague, was able to see that this was a feature of the period, not just in one document, but in many documents. Second, divorce was not always granted. If a woman desired divorce, this was not always something that was granted her or that came to be. Finally, this kind of document shows us the vicissitudes of life, the idea of orphans, the idea of mixed households, the ideas of Jews who had to move from one area to another. So this kind of document, whereas when the historian begins to look at it, first of all, you can see it's a challenge. It's ripped. It has places that are missing. It has key facts that are missing. It has, here the script is clear, but sometimes the script might be faded. For each fragment, like this one, the historian is sort of parachuted down into the middle of an entire family grouping, and you have to sort of figure out what's going on. On the other hand, this is the kind of document that is a historian's dream. Not every period, very few periods, have the luck to have troves of documents such as this one, and those of us who work in Judeo-Arabic and with Cairo Genizah sources do. So this is one example. The next text I brought to show you that women's worlds were better than it sounds here, and that there were protections for women in marriage. So here I want to show you an example of a prenuptial agreement from the Cairo Genizah, an example of grooms, potential grooms, who had to commit to certain types of behavior were they to enter into marriage contracts with women. And here again, I'm showing you a fragment from the Jewish Theological Seminary. This particular one was ripped and was pieced back together by scholars of the Cairo Genizah way back. I base my discussion here on the research of 2 people, my friend and colleague, Dr. Amir Ashur, and our mentor, Professor Mordechai Akiva Friedman of Tel Aviv University. This document is dated 1133 CE. So let's have a look at this one. And this was published by Mordechai Akiva Friedman and later again by Amir Ashur to exemplify the types of agreements that took place even before marriages. And particularly with a focus on wayward grooms who needed to be sort of brought into the marriage fold with appropriate behavioral norms. So it says, the wedding will take place after 2 full years from this match. It was stipulated that this Sit el-Banat, called Sa'ida, so her name is Sa'ida, but she has a nickname, Sit el-Banat, and many Geniza, Cairo Genizah women have names like this, Sit el-Ahil, Sit el-Banat, the madam of the women, the lady of the women. She will be trusted in what she says concerning her house, her ketubah, all food and drink, on all, for all, by him, during his life, and by all his heirs after him, like 2 valid, trusted witnesses. And you have to envision, although I haven't reproduced the original for you here, this is Judeo-Arabic with an admixture of legal terms in Hebrew and Aramaic. So the idea of witnesses, you would use the word edim in Hebrew. There will be upon her no oath whatsoever, not even an unspecified ban, and that he will not marry a wife besides her, nor acquire a slave girl whom she dislikes. So this is a prenuptial. We know the girl's name. This potential groom may not take a second wife or a concubine. Were he at any time to commit any of these, meaning were he to behave badly, not in a way that's in line with this prenuptial agreement, he would be required to pay her full delayed marriage payment, even though she be the one to demand to separate, to be divorced from him as a result of this. And that he does not have against her father any condition or claim concerning the trousseau, the dowry, whatsoever. Meaning, I'll just finish this document. He undertook also that he would follow commendable ways and not associate with anyone with whom it is not fitting to associate. If at any time it were verified that he had committed any humiliating act, he would owe 10 dinars as a gift to the girl. So you note, plenty of conditions here. I mean, there are heavy conditions. He's not allowed to take another wife, which it could have happened during that period in Jewish tradition. Not a concubine. She could divorce him, if so, and she could demand what women were to receive upon divorce, which is what's called the me'uchar, or in Arabic, the mu'achar, the delayed marriage payment, which is a fixed feature of discussions of marriage and divorce during this period. It was a sum of money that women would receive upon separation from their husband, upon divorce. I mentioned pressure in the previous document, and frequently this delayed marriage payment was something that women were pressured to decrease or to relinquish by courts. So this was a protection for women, but in practice, it was actually not always put into place. Then you notice this groom who is highlighted in an article by Mordechai Akiva Friedman and in the doctorate of Amir Ashur. He undertook that he would follow commendable ways and he would associate with the right kind of people. And there she wouldn't divorce him, but he would have to pay a fine. Meaning, this is a prenuptial agreement where the groom has to leave aside his bachelor ways. This is basically what we hear from this document. So another view into the idea of marriage, making a marriage connection and how this happened in this period. Now, a final document from daily life that I want to show you today has to do with books and copying books. So this is a fragment from Cambridge. It's a medieval request for the loan of a book. So I want to show you the actual document here. It is also a letter. You can see if you look at the top right of this page, it begins يا مولاي الخبير لعل تتفضل على عبدك بتفسير دانيال وعزرا. So my Lord, the khaber, a word of distinction for a scholar, perhaps you will deign to give me, and I'll bring you the translation so you can see. Perhaps you would deign to send your servant the tafsir of Daniel and Ezra of Rabbeinu Saadia, or the tafsir of Proverbs and Job of Rabbeinu Saadia. So here, by the way, I'm proving to you that not only did Saadia write these texts, but people wrote about them. People are using them. So somebody's asking for a loan of certain works, certain translations and commentaries of Rabbeinu Saadia, or one of the portions of the Torah of Rabbeinu Saadia. And you can see that in the fourth line. أو أحدا فراريش التوراة لربينو سعادية. Fararish, they also invented words. In Arabic, parasha, fararish, as the plural in Arabic. All of it. You can also see that in the fifth line. Al-kul. All of it should be with commentary, meaning don't give me just the tafsir, just the translation. I want translation and commentary. And it should not be like the tafsir of Psalms, of Tehillim. Why? Because it was in obscure script. So what is this writer saying? And I should note, by the way, that this particular fragment was published in a book that was published, edited by Nehemiah Aloni and Miriam Frankel. It's in Hebrew, it's called the Jewish Library in the Middle Ages, and they published a large collection of book lists of books, letters having to do with books, which had been collected over his lifetime by the scholar Nehemiah Aloni, a fascinating edifice of Jewish interest in books. So I took this fragment, I chose it from that volume. So here, what do we note? I'll just finish the document. I request that you answer and send me anything you have. Meaning, you see that he doesn't care that much. He just wants these works of Rav Saadia. And I kiss your generous hands. May you always be generous if God wills. And my wife kisses your hands. And my Lord, warm regards. Okay, as-salam at the end. You can see it on the bottom left. So on the one hand, this is a typical letter or petition. Okay, you start out with the word my Lord. There's a formality in Geniza letters. You start out with honorifics, epithets. This one is in the second person. It does say perhaps you. Oftentimes they're in the third person. They're so polite. It reflects the book culture of the period. It's not like our period. You can order a book from Amazon or go out to the bookstore. No, you had to order a copying of a book. If you had a book, it was an incredibly valuable possession. You kept track of your books. You made lists of your books. If you lent a book, you would write it down, who you had lent it to, when they were returning it. We find all of this in the Cairo Genizah. We have many other examples of documents having to do with books. We have lists of books that were loaned out, like I said. We have lists of somebody's library, personal libraries. What books do I have in my libraries? We have book lists of authors. All of the books written by Saadia Gaon, his sons, made a book list so that everybody would know what Saadia had written, which, by the way, tells us that books were rarer than today. You might not know that Saadia had written a certain book, so they made a list. You should know everything that Saadia wrote. We have letters from copyists of books. Do you want this one in Arabic script? Do you want this one in Hebrew script? it was obvious that the language of composition was Arabic, but you could request if you wanted it in Arabic script, in Hebrew script. As you see in this document, it shouldn't be in a difficult or obscure script. So we have a lot of documents that have to do with the idea of books and of reading. So this is a view into aspects of daily life in the Cairo Genizah, with the extent of works, fragments preserved in the Cairo Genizah. There could be 100 more lectures based on these documents. But right now, I want to move on to how we have these documents. How do we have this unique trove, which is the Cairo Genizah? So I want to talk about the discoveries of this trove. So there were early discoveries. And one of the earliest of the discoverers of the manuscript hunters who found out about the Cairo Genizah was a scholar, a traveler and scholar named Yaakov Safir. He was born in Belarus in the early 1800s. When he was 10 years old, he immigrated to the land of Israel with his family. He became an orphan 1 year later, moved to Jerusalem at some point. And what is interesting about Safir is that he was sent as an emissary throughout the Middle East to collect money for the poor of Jerusalem, also to collect money for the rebuilding of the Chorva synagogue, which nowadays in Jerusalem has been rebuilt, but back in the day needed rebuilding even then. So he traveled collecting funds. One thing that Safir is very famous for, he's almost considered an ethnographer or anthropologist. He wrote a book called Even Sapir, playing on his name, about his travels. And this book is actually quite a trove of knowledge about the Yemenite community of his time. It is a fascinating read. He wrote it in Hebrew. So he was certainly a polyglot, by the way. But in any case, on his travels, during his travels, he was in Egypt, he was in Old Cairo, and he was familiar with the fact that there were manuscripts from the Jewish community of Cairo in the Ben Ezra synagogue. And Safir writes about it in his memoirs. And I'm quoting here and basing myself on the research of Rebecca Jefferson, who wrote a wonderful book, which I will be showing you a picture of in a second, called Cairo Genizah, The Cairo Genizah and the Age of Discovery in Egypt, the History and Provenance of a Jewish Archive, where what Jefferson does is reveals the numerous discoverers who stand behind the discovery of this trove of documents that was the Cairo Genizah. So what Safir wrote, and he's writing in the mid-19th century, I found a new state of things here. The city as a whole had changed with wide streets and fine new houses, especially in the Jewish areas. And the 5 large synagogues, which had been in the last stages of dilapidation, were now demolished, and new ones built in their place, large and tall, embellished with blocks of pure marble. What Safir is talking about in this quote from his memoirs is a rebuilding project that happened in Cairo of the mid-19th century, where as part of the building of many new areas of Cairo, also ancient Jewish synagogues were rebuilt, were added to. As part of this, and the exact history is not clear, the exact things that happened to the trove that had been stored in the Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue is not clear, but we know that Safir, because of Rebecca Jefferson's research, that Safir was aware of the manuscripts that were being moved and discovered during this time, and he is one of the first who became aware of this trove of manuscripts. Another one of the discoverers, and I mentioned Avraham Firkovich in the previous lecture, in relation to the collection that is preserved in his name in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. Firkovich was a Karaite Jew. I discussed Karaites in the previous lecture. I focused on Karaites in the previous lecture in the period of the 9th century, the 10th century, perhaps the 11th. Here, we are talking about the Karaites of Eastern Europe. So if you remember the map from the previous lecture, Karaites, after dispersing in the Middle East, also moved up into Eastern Europe and established important, significant, prolific communities there throughout the Middle Ages. Firkovich was born in Lutsk, which was a center of Karaite settlement. He was a student of Karaite historians. He had connections with scholars from the Haskalah. He, in the 1830s, received an order from the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, to collect materials having to do with the origins of the Karaites. And he went on travels within the Russian-ruled areas at first. So we know that in the 1830s, he was in Crimea. He was in other areas of Karaite settlement in Russian-ruled areas. In his second round of travels in the 1860s, okay, when, as you can see here, he was quite an old man, he came into contact with the Jews of Cairo and with their manuscripts. And Avraham Firkovich had a keen eye for Genizot. This we know. We know this from his travels in the 1830s in the Crimea. And we know this from his discussion of his visit to Cairo. He had a keen eye for manuscripts. The beautiful monumental copy of Saadia's Tafsir that we looked at in the previous lecture was chosen by Firkovich. Firkovich went to Cairo, collected an astounding number of manuscripts, between 10 and 15,000 manuscripts, in some cases buying them, in some cases trading them, collected this collection, brought it back to Russia with him, and in the end sold it to the Tsar. This is the origin of the Firkovich collection of the Russian National Library, which is an incredible trove both of Karaite works, of Rabbinite works. As I said, our most faithful copy of Saadia's Tafsir was collected by Firkovich. He was a fascinating figure who recorded a diary in Hebrew, and which is also preserved in his collection. So this is Firkovich. We know that Firkovich did come into contact with manuscripts of the Ben Ezra synagogue. He did not take a lot of them. We do not know exactly what he took, but we do know that he was aware that there was a trove of manuscripts in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. An interesting feature of Firkovich, which has been laid plain by two of my colleagues, one of them quoted in her article here, Dr. Golda Achiezer. Firkovich is known as somebody who took liberties with manuscripts. Forgeries were a widespread European phenomenon in the 19th century. It was considered something one did, and Golda Achiezer has written about this. Firkovich sometimes tried to make manuscripts seem earlier than they were by changing certain things in the manuscripts. So this is not to detract from the extreme importance of the collection he created, but he was one who lived within the European manuscript culture of his period and did sometimes take liberties with his manuscripts. My friend and colleague, Dr. Professor Dan Shapira of Bar-Ilan University also wrote about Firkovich and his tombstone forgeries. So in order to make tombstones of the Karaite community of the Crimea seem earlier than they were, Firkovich was not against taking a chisel and chiseling letters, for example, to change a hey to a daled and they're gaining 1,000 years of Jewish history and the following. So I show you here a discussion, somewhat technical discussion of the tombstone forgeries of Firkovich here. So Firkovich was another early discoverer of the Geniza in the Ben Ezra synagogue of Cairo. And now we come to the people that you may have heard of before, Solomon Schechter and the two sisters from Cambridge, who were sort of the major discoverers and the most well-known discoverers of the Geniza. So Solomon Schechter, originally from Romania, was in 1890 appointed to the faculty at the Cambridge University, at the University of Cambridge in England, as a reader in Talmudic, as in Talmudic Judaism. He was good friends with the learned scholarly sisters, Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson. Again, here, Rebecca Jefferson has been extremely instrumental in helping all of us understand the role of these scholarly sisters in the discovery of the Geniza. And what happened was these sisters, who were learned, scholarly, widowed, they had time, went on frequent trips to the Middle East to find manuscripts. And they brought back with them from a particular trip to the Middle East various fragments which they brought to their friend Solomon Schechter in Cambridge in 1896 to look at. Solomon Schechter became very excited when he looked at the following fragment, which he realized, because of years of research that he had been doing on the text of Ben Sirah, a book that had originally been written in Hebrew but had survived only in Greek translation. And Schechter had for years been involved in research and even polemic regarding the original Hebrew text of Ben Sirah, which seemed not to have been survived. The last time it had been mentioned was in the 10th century. And they brought him this fragment along with other fragments. He realized that this was a piece of the original Hebrew of Ben Sirah, and he undertook an initially secret trip to Cairo to see if he could find the source of these manuscripts. So this brings us to the next and final section of this lecture, which is talking about the where, the places in which these manuscripts were preserved. As we saw in the quote from Yaakov Safir, there were a lot of restorations of synagogues going on in the 19th centuries. What you're looking at here is the cemetery known as Basatin in Cairo. And what we know is that the Jews of Cairo, when they had exhausted the space in the Geniza, the repository for old manuscripts, in the Ben Ezra synagogue, they had begun to, they would from time to time take loads of manuscripts and bury them in Basatin, in the cemetery. You gave manuscripts the kind of burial that you would do for people. This was the type of respect that one had for manuscripts. Firkovich himself, who, as you saw, preceded Solomon Schechter in Cairo, himself talks about how he went to the cemetery in order to unearth manuscripts. So some of the manuscripts that we have that reflect daily life in Cairo were also preserved in the Basatin cemetery. But the most important repository of manuscripts was found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo. This was the synagogue of the Rabbinite Jews. There was a different synagogue which served Karaite Jews and a different synagogue which served Jews from Iraq, from Babylonia. The Ben Ezra synagogue served the Rabbinite Jews. This synagogue, which was quite ancient and apparently had been built on an even more ancient synagogue, had a small room where Jews would deposit worn out texts. Which types of texts? Well, religious texts as well as the types that I showed you earlier today. We don't know exactly why, but the Jews of Cairo believed that all types of texts should be deposited in a Geniza, in a repository, rather than being thrown away. For this reason, beginning at some point in the 10th century, nearly until the present, entire archives of businessmen, documents relating to daily life, archives of judges, all of these were deposited in this small room, the Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo. These texts were deposited century after century, building up until the arrival of the discoverers, which I highlighted in the previous section. The most well-known discoverer being Solomon Schechter, if you recognize him also here. This was, so as I said, in 1896, he had this interchange with the two sisters, and leading him to this secret trip to Cairo. It had to be secret because many people were interested in discovering these manuscripts, and he had to get there faster and more quietly than others. He pretty much emptied the room that I just mentioned, that Geniza, which other people, Yaakov Safir and Avraham Firkovich and others, had looked in, had taken a few fragments from. Schechter pretty much emptied it, taking some 200,000 fragments back to the University of Cambridge, where he was given a special room. You can see this is the room. This is an entirely staged photograph where he looks nearly surrounded by fragments. As you can see, and he himself attests to this, he used boxes to categorize the different fragments. You can envision what kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish texts you would have to be able to pick up fragments that were often incredibly damaged. They had been for centuries lying on top of each other, dust, insects, all sorts of things that damaged them. How do we also know it's a staged photograph? These manuscripts smelled very bad. I mean, they had been basically in a rubbish room for a millennium. So he actually used to use what he called his nose mask to enable him to sit and not die from the smell and from the dust of these manuscripts. He also worked together with others. There were other scholars in Cambridge who helped him in dealing with the different types of materials that were found in these Geniza texts. So he was not alone in the room. There were others, and others who would come to see, and who would come to see this phenomenon of the texts and Schechter working on the text. So this is the emblematic picture, and it really exemplifies for us this trove of which I have shown you only a tiny piece. So this is the book by Rebecca Jefferson that I mentioned. What Jefferson has shown us so importantly is how many explorers there were prior to the 1896-1897 visit of Solomon Schechter, which certainly was the visit that ended up with the emptying of the Cairo Genizah and the bringing it to the eyes of the world and of research, and something we can learn from. But there were many discoverers over the 19th century and before who were aware of this trove. Probably the most important researcher following Schechter, who, by the way, had to leave his beloved Cairo Genizah Trove in Cambridge in the year 1902 when he went to serve as the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He did, by the way, take some of the fragments with him on loan so that he could continue to look at them. But he left his work cataloging and identifying the Trove in 1902. We come to Shlomo Dov Goldstein, who is probably the most important founder of the field of documentary Geniza studies. Goldstein came from Europe to Jerusalem. He was the first lecturer in the history of Islam and Muslim peoples at the newly founded Hebrew University. He came in the year 1927. In 1948, Goldstein underwent some kind of epiphany, where after having spent the beginning and middle, shall we say, of his scholarly career on scholarly texts of Islam, scholarly texts of Judaism, he realized how important the documentary Geniza was. These damaged, smelly fragments that Schechter had brought from Cambridge, from Egypt to Cambridge. And Goldstein, from the year 1948, began to devote himself to a study of the materials represented in the Geniza. What interested Goldstein was specifically the documents having to do with daily life. And he wrote a series of books, which you see in front of you. I put there volume 1. This was a series that was published between 1967 and his death in 1985. He died quite shortly after having finished the 5th book of these volumes. And he called this book, these volumes, which were based on the documents of the Cairo Genizah, a Jewish trove. He called it a Mediterranean society. And what he was reflecting was his belief that these documents were not just evocative of Jewish daily life, but also of Mediterranean daily life, that we could use them to study many different aspects of Mediterranean life and not just about Jews, which is quite true. So Goldstein's Mediterranean society is really a marker in the field. There are, one can say, many historians, many very talented historians who have followed Goldstein and are making important continuations, even corrections to Goldstein's work. But this is one of the markers of the field of documentary Geniza studies. I might say it's also fascinating reading, this Mediterranean society. So it's not my official book recommendation at the end of this lecture, but it is absolutely fascinating reading, beginning with economic foundations and ending in volume 5 with a study of the individual, and all of it on the basis of careful, painstaking readings of documents like the ones I showed you in the beginning of this lecture. Nowadays, we're very lucky. So we have come from the picture of Solomon Schechter in his beautiful, but sometimes dark and definitely smelly room at the University of Cambridge, where he's surrounded by Geniza fragments. We are blessed with projects that have digitized Cairo Genizah fragments. So one of the most important repositories of digitized fragments is at our very own National Library of Israel here in Jerusalem, with the Trove project, which provides us, and as you can see, these are the numbers as of a few weeks ago when I took this slide, but it's always rising, this number, thanks to the diligent efforts of the eminently knowledgeable staff of the National Library of Israel. So the scholar, or simply the layperson who is interested in Jewish manuscripts, can now go to this search engine, put in a topic, put in a repository of manuscripts, and come up with high-resolution images of manuscript fragments preserved around the world. So our work has become much easier thanks to the efforts of the staff of the National Library of Israel. Another very important modern repository of Geniza documents is the Princeton Geniza Lab. Goldstein, who I mentioned, founded the Princeton Geniza Lab, and it is still active today with a very active website So here, and I encourage you to open this website and see what you can find. Here you can put in a search. Let's say you're interested in the production of silk in modern day, in contemporaneous Cairo. You write in the search silk and you can come up with all of the documents, Geniza documents, in full resolution, oftentimes with the original text, with the translation. It is a fascinating, fascinating repository of information about Geniza documents. So I highly encourage you to look at that. And then further reading, I want to present two books. One is the book Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, a wonderful read and one that incorporates much scholarly research about the texts of the Cairo Genizah, both the ones I talked about in the first lecture, Judeo-Arabic scholarly literature, because the Cairo Genizah preserves scholarly literature as well, even though it wasn't the focus of this lecture. This is important to say, and focused on scholarly literature relating to documentary texts in the Cairo Genizah. Sacred Trash talks about the discovery of the Cairo Genizah and the various scholars who have worked on it. Eminently readable. It will make you laugh and you will learn a lot. So I recommend this book. And the final book I want to recommend is by Amitav Ghosh, who's an author who has written prolifically. This is Travels in an Antique Land, which was originally published in 1992, but has come out in many editions. Ghosh learned Hebrew script in order to be able to read documents from the Cairo Genizah, and he juxtaposes chapters having to do with a modern-day Egyptian village and chapters relating to the medieval Cairo Genizah society. So it's a fascinating work that sort of juxtaposes fiction and nonfiction, and I highly recommend it. Do join me at the next lecture where we talk about the transition from Judeo-Arabic to Hebrew. The default language in our first lecture was Judeo-Arabic for writing about scholarship. The default language for daily life in today's lecture was clearly Judeo-Arabic. What we're going to talk about in the next lecture is when did this change? Thank you very much for joining me.